My name is Ezekiel Torino. I'm an air traffic controller at Billings-Logan International Airport. 90 days ago, Yellowstone erupted and plunged our world into an ice age. I watched planes fall from ash-filled skies while coordinating the last flights to safety. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 months. Snow started falling in August and never stopped. I became the voice connecting survivor groups across Montana until my radio died and left me completely alone. I've seen civilization collapse in real time. I've made life and death decisions for people I never met. I've learned what it really takes to survive when the world freezes overnight. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are. Tuning in from in the comment section below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Ezekiel Torino, but everyone calls me Zeke. For 12 years, I guided aircraft through some of the most challenging airspace in Montana from my position at Billings-Logan International Airport. I thought I had seen every kind of emergency situation you could imagine. Severe thunderstorms that turned the sky black as midnight. Blizzards that dropped visibility to 0 in minutes. Medical emergencies where every second counted to get a plane on the ground safely. I prided myself on staying calm under pressure, on being the steady voice that pilots could count on when everything went wrong. But nothing in my training prepared me for July 23, 2024. Nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened that morning when Yellowstone decided to remind the world just how powerless we really are. I was working the night shift, which meant I had been in the control tower since 11 the previous evening. The airport was relatively quiet. Just a few cargo flights and the usual early morning commuter traffic starting to pick up. I remember checking the weather reports and thinking it was going to be another beautiful summer day in Montana. Clear skies, temperature heading toward the mid-80s, light winds, perfect flying weather. At exactly 6:47 in the morning, the ground started shaking. Now we get minor earthquakes in Montana from time to time, nothing that usually amounts to much. But this was different. The whole control tower was swaying like a tree in a windstorm. Coffee cups slid off desks. The radar screens flickered and went static for a few seconds. I grabbed onto my console and waited for it to pass, thinking maybe we had a bigger tremor than usual. Then my phone started ringing. Not just my direct line, but every phone in the facility. The emergency notification system kicked in with that piercing tone that makes your blood run cold. The first alert that came across said seismic activity, detected in Yellowstone National Park. Magnitude 7.2. I remember thinking that was unusual, but not catastrophic. We had protocols for this kind of thing. The second alert came 3 minutes later. Volcanic eruption confirmed at Yellowstone caldera. Immediate evacuation recommended for areas within 100 miles. I stared at that message for a few seconds, trying to process what it meant. Billings was about 300 miles from Yellowstone. We were supposed to be far enough away to be safe. The third alert changed everything. Massive ash ejection detected. Regional air traffic suspension recommended. Aircraft advised to divert immediately. That was when the real chaos started. Every pilot within 500 miles was trying to reach me at once. Regional jets inbound from Denver asking for immediate landing clearance. Private aircraft requesting emergency vectors to alternate airports. Cargo flights demanding to know if the runway was still operational. My radio was a constant stream of voices, each one more urgent than the last. I had been trained for this kind of scenario in theory. Volcanic ash is one of the most dangerous things an aircraft can encounter. The particles are like microscopic glass that can destroy jet engines in minutes. They can clog pitot tubes, sandblast windshields, and cause complete electrical failure. Every pilot knows to avoid ash clouds at all costs, but when a supervolcano erupts, there might not be anywhere safe to go. I started coordinating emergency landings as fast as I could process the requests. Priority went to the commercial flights with passengers, then medical emergencies, then cargo. I had pilots reporting unusual readings on their instruments, visibility dropping rapidly, and what they described as heavy gray snow falling at altitude in July in Montana. By 9 o'clock that morning, I could see it myself. The sky to the southwest was turning an ominous dark gray, like the worst thunderstorm you have ever seen, except it stretched from horizon to horizon. The color was all wrong, though. Thunderstorms have a greenish tint when they are really dangerous. This was the color of concrete dust, spreading across the sky like spilled paint. The temperature started dropping around 10 o'clock. I noticed it first when I stepped outside to check the wind instruments manually. It felt like autumn air, crisp and cool, completely wrong for a July morning that should have been heading toward 80 degrees. My breath was visible in the air. In July, in Montana. My father had been a career Air Force controller before he retired, and he had always told me that when things go wrong in aviation, they go wrong fast. Communication is everything, he used to say. When the lights go out and the radios fail, the person who can still talk to people is the person who saves lives. I had installed an extensive amateur radio setup in my apartment years ago, partly as a hobby but partly because his words had stuck with me. That morning I started to understand why he had been so insistent about backup communications. The ash cloud reached Billings around noon. 1 minute I could see clear across the city to the rim rocks in the distance. The next minute, everything beyond the airport fence disappeared into a gray wall of falling ash. It looked exactly like heavy snow, except it was July and the temperature had dropped to 60 degrees. People were coming outside to look at it, holding their hands out to catch the flakes like children seeing snow for the first time. They had no idea what they were breathing. The emergency services were getting overwhelmed. I could hear it in the radio chatter between the police, fire department, and ambulance services. Car accidents were spiking as the ash made road surfaces slippery, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The hospital was reporting respiratory problems, especially among people with asthma or other breathing conditions. Hardware stores were running out of dust masks and air filters. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees and the ash was falling so heavily that I could barely see the runway from the control tower. That was when I got the call that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Delta Flight 427, inbound from Seattle with 138 passengers and crew, requesting immediate emergency landing. They were running low on fuel after multiple diversions and their instruments were giving erratic readings from ash ingestion. I could barely hear the pilot through the static. He was describing conditions I had never heard before. Complete loss of visibility, engines running rough, electrical systems flickering on and off. He needed vectors to the runway, but I was guiding him blind through an ash cloud so thick that our ground radar was having trouble painting a clear picture. For 20 agonizing minutes, I talked that pilot down through conditions that should have been impossible to fly in. I gave him headings based on what I could see on my instruments, altitude corrections to keep him on the glide path, and constant reassurance that the runway was clear and waiting. I could hear the strain in his voice as he fought to keep that aircraft under control with systems failing and engines struggling in the volcanic ash. When he finally broke through the cloud base at 200 feet above the runway, I could see his landing lights cutting through the gray like pale ghosts. The aircraft was covered in ash, the windscreen so abraded that I wondered how he could see to land at all. But he got it down safe. All 138 souls aboard unharmed. That was the last commercial flight I would ever guide to, a safe landing. The FAA issued a complete ground stop for the region an hour later. No aircraft would be permitted to take off or land until the ash cloud cleared. The problem was, the ash was not clearing. If anything, it was getting thicker. Weather reports from Wyoming were describing ashfalls measured in feet, not inches. Yellowstone was still erupting, still pumping millions of tons of debris into the atmosphere. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. In July, the ash had coated everything in a layer of gray powder that looked like dirty snow but felt like sand between your fingers. People were starting to realize this was not going to be over quickly. The grocery stores in town were seeing runs on bottled water, canned food, and anything people thought they might need for an extended emergency. I stayed at the airport that night, monitoring emergency frequencies and coordinating with what remained of regional air traffic control. Most airports within 300 miles of Yellowstone had shut down completely. The ash was playing havoc with electronics, clogging air filters and coating everything with an abrasive dust that destroyed machinery. The really disturbing reports were coming from my amateur radio contacts. Operators in Wyoming were describing ash drifts 20 feet deep in some areas. Towns that had lost power when the weight of ash brought down transmission lines. Water treatment plants shutting down because the ash was overwhelming their filtration systems. These were not temporary problems. This was infrastructure collapse happening in real time. What scared me most was how quickly normal life was disappearing. By the third day, most of the city had lost power as the ash accumulated on transmission lines and insulators. The airport was running on backup generators, but even those were struggling as air filters clogged faster than we could replace them. Commercial flights were not just suspended, they were impossible. The entire regional aviation system had simply stopped functioning. People were starting to understand that help was not coming anytime soon. The ash cloud stretched from Canada to Colorado, from the Dakotas to Idaho. Millions of people were affected, and the normal disaster response infrastructure was completely overwhelmed. This was not a hurricane that would pass in a few days or a blizzard that would melt by spring. This was something unprecedented in modern times. By the end of the first week, I realized I was looking at the collapse of everything I had taken for granted my entire life. The sky was still gray. The temperature was still dropping. The ash was still falling. And somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this was just the beginning of something much worse. The radio chatter from other regions was becoming increasingly desperate. Reports of crop failures across the Midwest as ash blocked sunlight. Livestock dying from respiratory problems. Transportation networks shutting down as engines failed and roads became impassable. The normal supply chains that kept modern civilization running were breaking down faster than anyone had imagined possible. I started making preparations for a much longer emergency than anyone was officially acknowledging. My amateur radio equipment was going to be crucial for maintaining contact with the outside world. The airport control tower would make an excellent observation post and communications center. Most importantly, I began to understand that my skills in coordinating aircraft might be exactly what scattered groups of survivors would need to coordinate their own survival efforts. By the 8th day after Yellowstone erupted, I had made the decision that would define everything that came after. The airport control tower was going to be my base of operations, and I was going to use every piece of radio equipment at my disposal to create a communication network for survivors across the region. The tower had several advantages that made it perfect for long-term survival. It sat 90 feet above ground level, giving me clear line of sight in all directions. The backup power systems were designed to run for weeks if necessary. Most importantly, it housed some of the most sophisticated radio equipment in the state. I moved my personal amateur radio gear from my apartment to the tower, combining it with the airport's emergency communication systems to create what I started calling the Montana Survival Network. My call sign was K7TZR, but I began identifying myself simply as Billings Tower to anyone who responded to my broadcasts. Within hours of going on the air, I was making contact with survivor groups across Montana and into neighboring states. The first group to respond was calling themselves Hospital Base. They were medical staff and patients who had taken shelter at St. Vincent Healthcare when the power grid started failing. Dr. Sarah Martinez was their spokesperson, and she painted a grim picture of their situation. They had medical supplies and expertise, but they were essentially trapped in the building as ash drifts blocked most of the exits. They had maybe 40 people, including several patients on life support running off backup generators that would not last much longer. The second group was at Lewis and Clark Elementary School on the south side of Billings. They called themselves Schoolhouse, and they were mostly families with young children who had sought shelter when their homes lost power. Their leader was a retired Army sergeant named Tom Bradley, who had experience with emergency management. They had about 60 people, plenty of space, and access to the school kitchen facilities, but they were running critically low on food and heating fuel. The third major group had established themselves at Rimrock Mall. They were calling themselves Market Base, and they were primarily retail workers who had been caught at the mall when the eruption happened and decided to stay. They had access to the food court, several stores with supplies, and a large anchor store that they had converted into sleeping quarters. Their coordinator was Lisa Chen, who had been an assistant manager at one of the department stores. They had about 30 people and the best access to material supplies, but they were having problems with heating, as the mall was not designed to be energy efficient. Within the first week of establishing regular contact, I realized that my background in air traffic control was perfectly suited for coordinating between these groups. I was used to tracking multiple aircraft simultaneously, understanding their different needs and capabilities, and making split-second decisions about priorities and routing. Managing survivor groups required exactly the same skills, just applied to people on the ground instead of planes in the air. The first major coordination challenge came on day 12. Hospital Base was facing a critical shortage of heating fuel for their backup generators. Without power, their life support patients would die within hours. Market Base had located a supply of diesel fuel in the loading dock area, but they did not have any way to transport it across the city. Schoolhouse had access to a school bus that was still operational, but they needed medical supplies for children who were developing respiratory problems from ash exposure. I spent 6 hours on the radio that day coordinating a 3-way resource exchange that would save lives in all 3 locations. The school bus would go to Market Base, pick up the diesel fuel and some basic medical supplies, deliver the fuel to Hospital Base, and return to Schoolhouse with antibiotics and inhalers for the children. It sounds simple when I describe it now, but navigating that bus through ash-covered streets with almost zero visibility required constant radio contact and turn-by-turn directions. Tom Bradley drove that bus himself, with me providing navigation from the tower using what remained of the city's traffic camera system. I could guide him around accidents, collapsed buildings, and areas where the ash drifts were too deep for the bus to navigate. The trip that should have taken 30 minutes in normal conditions took over 3 hours, but we got that fuel delivered, and those kids got the medicine they needed. That success established the pattern for everything that followed. Groups would contact me with their needs and capabilities, and I would coordinate exchanges that benefited everyone involved. Schoolhouse had access to the district's maintenance equipment, which was useful for clearing roads and repairing buildings. Hospital Base had medical expertise that was crucial when people got injured or sick. Market Base had access to tools, clothing, and other supplies that the other groups desperately needed. But even as we were successfully coordinating these local exchanges, I was getting increasingly disturbing reports from my longer-range radio contacts. Denver had gone completely silent on day 10, with the last transmission describing total infrastructure collapse and martial law. Seattle was reporting mass evacuations to the south, but they were not sure where the evacuees were going or if they were surviving the journey. Minneapolis was still transmitting, but they were describing conditions that sounded like something out of an apocalypse movie. The amateur radio networks that normally connected operators across the country were fragmenting as stations went off the air one by one. Some were equipment failures as ash destroyed electronics. Others were power failures as backup systems ran out of fuel. But some stations just stopped transmitting with no explanation. And that was the most terrifying possibility of all. Weather reports from my aviation contacts were consistently grim. The ash cloud was not dissipating as quickly as anyone had hoped. Atmospheric models were suggesting that enough debris had been ejected into the upper atmosphere to significantly reduce solar radiation for months or possibly years. Agricultural areas across the Midwest were reporting complete crop failures as plants could not photosynthesize in the reduced sunlight. On day 15, I coordinated the most complex operation yet. A family with a diabetic child had been trapped in their home on the west side of the city when an ash drift blocked their street. The child was running out of insulin and would go into diabetic coma without medical intervention. Hospital Base had insulin, but they could not spare anyone to make the dangerous journey across the city. Market Base had a 4-wheel drive vehicle that could navigate the ash drifts, but none of their people had medical training. The solution required coordination between all 3 groups and precise timing. Schoolhouse would provide Tom Bradley as the driver, since he had the most experience navigating the treacherous conditions. Market Base would provide the vehicle and additional supplies for the stranded family. Hospital Base would provide the insulin and detailed instructions for administering it if the child went into crisis during transport. I spent 4 hours on the radio that day, providing navigation and coordination. Tom had to winch the vehicle through several areas where the ash drifts were deeper than the vehicle's clearance. Twice he had to stop and dig out the wheels when the ash proved too soft to support the truck's weight. The family's home was almost completely buried, with only the second-story windows visible above the ash line. They got that child to hospital base just hours before a diabetic emergency would have become fatal. It was exactly the kind of success that made all the risks and effort worthwhile, but it also highlighted how precarious our situation was becoming. We were operating with limited resources, dangerous conditions, and no backup if something went wrong. The psychological strain was starting to show on everyone. People were sleeping poorly, partly because of the stress and partly because the ash in the atmosphere had created a permanent twilight that confused normal sleep cycles. Tempers were getting shorter as resources became scarcer. I found myself mediating disputes between groups over everything from fuel allocation to work assignments. Market Base and Schoolhouse had a serious disagreement on day 18 over access to winter clothing from the department stores. The families with children argued that kids should have priority for warm clothing as the temperatures continued to drop. The retail workers argued that they had been protecting those supplies and deserved first access for their own people. It took 3 hours of radio negotiation to work out a distribution system that everyone could accept. Hospital Base was facing their own internal conflicts as medical supplies ran low, and they had to make increasingly difficult decisions about patient care. Dr. Martinez confided to me during a private radio conversation that they were having to perform triage not just on new patients, but on existing patients whose long-term care was consuming resources that might save more lives elsewhere. What worried me most was that similar conflicts were probably happening in survivor groups across the region, but I was no longer in contact with most of them. Stations that had been regular check-ins were going silent, sometimes after reporting equipment problems, sometimes after describing increasing desperation, and sometimes with no explanation at all. The reports from those stations still operating painted a consistent picture of civilization, collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. Transportation networks were shut down across most of the western United States. The power grid was failing, in cascading failures as generating stations went offline, and repair crews could not reach damaged infrastructure. Food distribution had essentially stopped as trucking companies could not operate in the conditions. On day 20, I made contact with another air traffic controller at Great Falls, about 200 miles north of Billings. His call sign was N7QRP, and his name was Mike Stevens. He had established a similar coordination network for survivors in his area, but his situation was even more desperate than ours. Great Falls had received heavier ashfall, and the temperature drops were more severe. Several of his survivor groups had already gone silent. Mike and I began sharing information and coordination techniques. He had developed better methods for rationing fuel and food. I had figured out more efficient ways to navigate through ash drifts and coordinate multi-group operations. Together, we started to build a regional network that could share resources and information across a much wider area. But Mike also confirmed my worst fears about what was happening beyond our immediate region. He had been in contact with controllers in North Dakota and Wyoming until recently, and their report suggested that the situation was deteriorating rapidly across the entire northern Great Plains. Fargo had gone silent after reporting social unrest and breakdowns in law enforcement. Cheyenne was still transmitting, but they were describing conditions that sounded like the complete collapse of local government. By day 25, I had established regular contact with 7 survivor groups in the Billings area and was coordinating resource sharing among nearly 300 people. But I was also beginning to understand that we were probably among the lucky ones. We had the advantage of my radio equipment and coordination experience. We had groups with complementary resources and skills. Most importantly, we had established cooperation before desperation drove people to more extreme measures. The bigger picture was becoming clear, and it was terrifying. This was not a temporary disaster that would be resolved by outside help. The infrastructure collapse was too widespread, and the environmental conditions were too severe for any kind of normal recovery. We were looking at a fundamental change in how human society would function, and most people were not prepared for that reality. The amateur radio networks were reporting similar patterns across the entire western United States. Initial cooperation giving way to resource conflicts, temporary shelters becoming permanent communities, local authorities losing control as federal and state governments became overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. It was becoming clear that the survivors who would make it through this catastrophe would be the ones who could adapt quickly to a completely different world. On day 26, something happened that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. It started snowing in August. Not the gray ash that had been falling for over a month, but actual white snow falling from clouds that had formed in the unnaturally cold atmosphere. I watched it through the control tower windows, trying to process what this meant for our long-term survival. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. In August, in Montana, within hours, that snow was accumulating on top of the existing ash layers, creating a mixture that was heavier and more dangerous than either substance alone. Buildings that had survived the ashfall started collapsing under the additional weight. Power lines that had remained intact finally snapped under the accumulated load. The few roads we had managed to keep partially clear became completely impassable, as the snow mixed with ash to create something like wet concrete. I spent that entire day on the radio coordinating emergency responses as the infrastructure around us continued to collapse. The Billings Public Library, which had been serving as a shelter for about 20 people, sent out a distress call when their roof started sagging under the weight. Schoolhouse reported that 2 of their portable classrooms had collapsed overnight, forcing them to relocate 40 people into already overcrowded spaces. Market Base was dealing with flooding as the snow melted and mixed with ash to create a slurry that backed up storm drains and flowed into the lower levels of the mall. Hospital Base was facing the most critical situation. The weight of accumulated precipitation had damaged the hospital's emergency power connections, causing intermittent failures that threatened their life support patients. Dr. Martinez was requesting immediate assistance to reinforce their backup power systems before they lost patients to equipment failures. But with the roads now completely impassable, getting help to them seemed impossible. Tom Bradley volunteered to attempt the journey from schoolhouse to hospital base, using the district's heaviest snowplow. It was a machine designed for the worst Montana winters, but nothing like the conditions we were facing. I coordinated that operation from the tower, using traffic cameras that were still functional to guide him through a city that was becoming increasingly unrecognizable. The trip that should have taken 20 minutes required 4 hours of constant maneuvering around collapsed buildings, abandoned vehicles, and drifts that were deeper than the plow could handle. Tom had to backtrack multiple times when streets proved completely blocked, and twice he had to winch the plow out of situations where it got stuck in the ash and snow mixture. But he made it to hospital base with the electrical equipment and fuel they needed to stabilize their power situation. While Tom was making that dangerous journey, I was receiving increasingly desperate radio calls from other survivor groups that I had not heard from in days. A group of families trapped in a subdivision on the north side of town were reporting that their emergency heat had failed, and they were burning furniture to stay warm. An elderly couple holed up in a farmhouse east of the city had not responded to radio calls for 36 hours. A group of college students who had been sheltering in a dormitory were requesting evacuation after part of their building collapsed. The harsh reality was that I could coordinate help for maybe 1 or 2 of these emergencies, but not all of them. We were operating with limited resources, dangerous conditions, and equipment that was being pushed far beyond its design limits. Every rescue mission put our most capable people at risk, and losing Tom Bradley or one of the other experienced drivers would cripple our ability to help anyone. I had to make decisions that no one should ever have to make. Which group was most likely to survive without immediate help? Which emergency was most critical? Which risks were justified by the potential to save lives? These calculations haunted me every time I transmitted coordinates for a rescue mission or advised a group that help was not available. The psychological pressure was affecting everyone in our network. Hospital Base reported increasing incidents of depression and anxiety among both staff and patients. Schoolhouse was dealing with behavioral problems among the children who were struggling to understand why they could not go home. Market Base had seen 2 suicide attempts in the past week, as people faced the reality that their previous lives were gone forever. My own mental state was deteriorating under the constant stress of life and death. Decisions. I was sleeping maybe 3 hours a night, monitoring radio frequencies around the clock for emergency calls. I had started talking to myself during the long, quiet periods, carrying on conversations with pilots who would never call for landing clearance again. Sometimes I caught myself giving vectors to aircraft that existed only in my memory. The weather reports from my remaining aviation contacts were consistently terrifying. The ash and debris in the upper atmosphere were blocking so much solar radiation that atmospheric models predicted continuing temperature drops for months or years. Agricultural regions across North America were reporting complete crop failures. Livestock was dying from respiratory problems and lack of feed. The global food supply chain had essentially collapsed. On day 32, I received a radio transmission that changed everything about how I understood our situation. A weak signal from somewhere in Wyoming was transmitting in Morse code, probably because voice communications were no longer possible with their damaged equipment. The message was simple but chilling. Cheyenne gone, Denver gone, population fled south. Do not attempt rescue, repeat, do not attempt rescue. I tried to re-establish contact with that station for hours but never heard from them again. The silence from major population centers was becoming a pattern that suggested something far worse than infrastructure collapse. It suggested that entire cities were being abandoned as uninhabitable, with populations either fleeing to warmer climates or simply disappearing entirely. My contact with Mike Stevens in Great Falls was becoming sporadic as his equipment suffered damage from the extreme conditions. During our last clear conversation, he reported that several of his survivor groups had gone completely silent, and he suspected that some had abandoned their shelters to attempt migration south. He had tried to discourage these migrations because travel conditions were so dangerous, but desperation was driving people to attempt journeys that were almost certainly fatal. The temperature continued dropping throughout September. By day, 40. We were seeing nighttime lows in the teens and daytime highs that barely reached freezing. This was not normal weather variation. This was a fundamental change in climate that showed no signs of reversing. The snow was now falling almost continuously, accumulating faster than the wind could redistribute it. Billings was transforming into something unrecognizable. Main Street had disappeared under snowdrifts that reached second-story windows. The Yellowstone River, which had flowed freely through harsh winters for thousands of years, was frozen solid for the first time in recorded history. Familiar landmarks were either buried or transformed into strange ice formations that looked like abstract sculptures. Our 3 main survivor groups were adapting to these impossible conditions, but the strain was showing. Schoolhouse had consolidated their population into the gymnasium and main building, abandoning the portable classrooms that could not be adequately heated. They were burning desks, chairs, and anything else combustible to maintain minimal temperatures for the children. Food rationing had become severe, with adults eating 1 meal per day so children could have 2. Market Base had the advantage of access to winter clothing and camping equipment from the sporting goods stores, but they were struggling with water as their pipes froze and the mall's heating system failed completely. They had resorted to melting snow for drinking water, a process that consumed precious fuel and never provided enough clean water for their population. Lisa Chen reported that they were considering abandoning the lower level of the mall entirely, as it became too cold and dangerous to occupy. Hospital Base was facing the most complex challenges. They had medical equipment that required consistent power and temperature control, but maintaining those conditions was consuming their fuel reserves at an unsustainable rate. Dr. Martinez had made the difficult decision to discontinue life support for patients whose conditions were terminal, conserving resources for people who might survive if given adequate care. These were decisions that violated every principle of medical ethics, but the alternative was losing everyone. The coordination between groups was becoming more difficult as travel became nearly impossible. The school bus that had been our primary means of transportation was now unable to navigate most streets. Tom Bradley had rigged up a tracked vehicle, using parts from snowmobiles and construction equipment. But it could only carry a few people and broke down frequently in the extreme conditions. Resource disputes were becoming more frequent and more serious. When Hospital Base requested additional heating fuel, Market Base argued that their medical facilities would be useless if their own population froze to death. When Schoolhouse needed tools to repair their heating system, the other groups were reluctant to risk their own maintenance capabilities. I found myself spending hours each day mediating conflicts that had no perfect solutions. The amateur radio networks that had connected us to the outside world were failing at an accelerating pace. Stations that had been regular contacts were going silent without explanation. Equipment was failing faster than it could be repaired, especially electronic components that were not designed for extreme cold conditions. My own radio setup was showing signs of stress, with some frequencies becoming unreliable and backup systems consuming power faster than the solar panels could recharge batteries. On day 45, I coordinated what would turn out to be our last major multi-group operation. A family of 5 was trapped in a house that had partially collapsed under snow load, with one member seriously injured and requiring immediate medical attention. The rescue required Schoolhouse to provide the tracked vehicle and driver, Market Base to supply cutting tools and safety equipment, and Hospital Base to send a medic who could provide emergency care during transport. The operation took 8 hours and nearly resulted in the loss of our only remaining transportation, when the tracked vehicle broke through ice into a flooded basement. Tom Bradley and the medical team barely escaped, and the injured person died during transport despite their efforts. It was a sobering reminder that our capabilities were limited and our resources were irreplaceable. The failure of that rescue mission seemed to mark a turning point in group morale. People were beginning to understand that help was not coming from outside, that government agencies were not going to restore normalcy, and that the world they had known was gone permanently. Some individuals were talking about attempting to walk south to warmer climates, despite the obvious impossibility of surviving such a journey in current conditions. I was also beginning to hear disturbing reports from the few radio contacts still operating in other regions. Stations in Colorado were describing social breakdown and conflicts over resources that had escalated into violence. A contact in Nebraska reported that organized groups were raiding smaller communities for supplies, with no law enforcement capable of intervening. These reports suggested that the social fabric that held civilization together was dissolving as quickly as the physical infrastructure. By day 50, I realized that we had moved beyond the initial emergency phase and into something that would define the rest of our lives. This was not a disaster with a recovery period. This was a permanent change in how human beings would live on Earth. The survivors who made it through the next few months would be the founders of whatever society emerged from the collapse of the old world. The radio chatter that remained was increasingly desperate and disorganized. People were making plans that had no basis in reality, clinging to hopes for rescue or recovery that were clearly impossible. The psychological strain of accepting that everything they had known was gone forever was more than most people could bear. I knew that maintaining our small network of survivor groups was probably the most important thing I could do. But I also knew that our situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Equipment was failing, supplies were running out, and the environmental conditions continued to deteriorate. We were approaching decisions that would determine who lived and who died, and I was not sure any of us were prepared for what that would require. On day 46, everything changed in a way that I had been dreading but somehow still was not prepared for. The backup generators at the airport finally ran out of fuel, and with them went my connection to the outside world. I had been rationing power for weeks, running the radio equipment for only a few hours each day to conserve fuel, but the math had always been simple and brutal. The generators consumed more fuel than we could possibly acquire in these conditions, and eventually they would stop running. I remember the exact moment when the lights went out. I was in the middle of coordinating a supply exchange between Hospital Base and Schoolhouse when the radio simply went dead. The control tower that had been my command center for nearly 7 weeks became nothing more than a tall building with an excellent view of a frozen wasteland. The silence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time since the eruption, I could not reach out to another human being with the push of a button. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. I had grown accustomed to the constant background chatter of radio communications, the regular check-ins with the survivor groups, the sense that I was connected to a larger community of people fighting to stay alive. Without that connection, the control tower became a prison 90 feet above a dead city, and I became a prisoner trapped with my own thoughts and fears. I spent the first day after losing power trying everything I could think of to restore communications. I had portable battery-powered radios, but their range was so limited that I could not reach any of the survivor groups from the tower. I tried moving to different locations in the building, adjusting antennas, even climbing onto the roof to get better line of sight. But nothing worked. The groups that I'd been coordinating for weeks had suddenly become as isolated from me as I was from them. The silence forced me to confront realities that I had been avoiding while focused on the immediate demands of coordination. I was essentially alone in a building with limited food supplies, no heat except what I could generate by burning furniture, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. Worse, I had no way of knowing what was happening to the people who had been depending on me for coordination and support. On day 50, I made the decision to leave the control tower and venture into the city to make contact with the survivor groups. I had avoided leaving the tower for weeks because it was safer and more useful as a communication center, but with the radios dead, staying there was just waiting to die slowly. I loaded a backpack with emergency supplies, put on every layer of clothing I owned, and began the dangerous journey down into Billings. The city was unrecognizable. Streets that I had driven for years had disappeared under snowdrifts that reached 20 feet in some areas. Buildings had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice, creating obstacle courses of debris and unstable structures. The few landmarks that remained visible were coated in ice formations that made them look like abstract sculptures rather than functional buildings. Navigation was almost impossible. Street signs were buried, familiar buildings were unrecognizable, and the GPS systems in vehicles had failed when the satellites went out of range weeks earlier. I had to navigate by memory and instinct, following power lines and other linear features that I hoped would lead me toward areas where people might still be alive. The journey to schoolhouse, which should have taken 20 minutes by car, required 8 hours of dangerous travel through conditions that tested every survival skill I had ever learned. I had to climb over collapsed buildings, crawl under ice formations, and wade through snowdrifts that were sometimes deeper than I was tall. Twice I fell through ice into flooded basements and had to climb out soaking wet in sub-zero temperatures. When I finally reached the school, I found it partially abandoned. The main building was still occupied, but most of the portable structures had been abandoned as uninhabitable. Tom Bradley met me at what had been the main entrance, now accessible only through a tunnel they had dug through the snowdrifts. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the 7 weeks since the eruption. The situation at schoolhouse was worse than anything I had imagined from our radio conversations. They were down to fewer than 30 people from the original 60, with some families leaving to attempt migration south, and others simply disappearing during supply runs or other necessary trips outside the building. Food supplies were critically low, with people eating one small meal every other day. Several children were showing signs of malnutrition, and 2 elderly people had died from hypothermia when the heating system failed completely. Tom told me that they had lost contact with Market Base a week earlier when their radio equipment failed, and Hospital Base had stopped responding 3 days ago. The tracked vehicle that had been our primary means of transportation had broken down completely, leaving them with no way to coordinate with other groups or conduct supply runs. They were essentially trapped in the school with dwindling resources and no plan for long-term survival. I spent 2 days at schoolhouse helping them reorganize their resources and develop strategies for surviving without outside support. We consolidated the population into the most defensible and heatable spaces, established strict rationing protocols, and identified potential sources of fuel and food within walking distance. But even with careful management, it was clear that they had maybe 2 weeks of supplies remaining. The journey to Market Base required another full day of dangerous travel through increasingly hostile conditions. The mall was partially collapsed, with the entire west wing uninhabitable due to structural damage from snow loads. The main concourse had become a makeshift village, with families living in spaces that had once been stores. Lisa Chen had established impressive resource management systems, but their situation was equally desperate. Market Base had advantages in terms of access to supplies, but they were facing critical shortages of heating fuel and food. The sporting goods stores had provided excellent winter clothing and camping equipment, but they could not eat camping gear or burn clothing indefinitely. They had lost 8 people to various causes, including accidents during supply gathering, hypothermia, and 1 suicide. The psychological strain was evident in everyone I met. Lisa had been keeping detailed records of their resource consumption and had calculated that they could survive perhaps another month with strict rationing, but she also acknowledged that this calculation assumed no additional equipment failures, no further casualties, and no significant changes in weather conditions. Any of those factors could reduce their survival time dramatically. Hospital Base was the most heartbreaking stop on my journey through the Dead City. Dr. Martinez and her staff had managed to keep some of their most critical patients alive, but they had been forced to make decisions that violated every principle of medical ethics. Life support had been discontinued for patients whose conditions were terminal. Pain medication was being rationed even for people who were clearly dying. Medical equipment that required consistent power had been shut down to conserve fuel for heating. The hospital staff were showing signs of severe psychological trauma from the decisions they had been forced to make. Dr. Martinez told me privately that 3 nurses had suffered complete mental breakdowns, and she was not sure how much longer the remaining staff could continue functioning under these conditions. They were essentially practicing disaster medicine without any hope of outside support or resource replenishment. What disturbed me most during these visits was the evidence I found of other people who had not made it. Frozen bodies in collapsed buildings. Evidence of desperate attempts to find food or fuel that had ended in tragedy. Signs that some groups had simply disappeared, leaving behind only abandoned shelters and scattered belongings that told stories of desperation and failed survival attempts. I also found evidence that suggested some people were still alive but had become dangerous. Buildings that had been systematically looted, signs of violence and struggle, reports from all 3 groups of encounters with individuals or small groups who were clearly willing to take resources by force rather than cooperation. The social bonds that had held our community together were beginning to fracture under the pressure of desperation. During my travels between groups, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of our long-term prospects. In a residential area on the east side of the city, I found a house where someone had established an impressive survival setup. Solar panels jury-rigged to charge batteries, a wood-burning stove that had been expertly installed, and food storage systems that suggested careful long-term planning. But the house was abandoned, with signs that the occupants had left recently and voluntarily. Inside the house, I found a detailed journal that told the story of a family's survival efforts and their eventual decision to abandon Billings entirely. The final entries described their conclusion that the climate change was permanent and that survival in Montana was impossible long-term. They had decided to attempt a migration south, traveling on foot with carefully planned supply caches, despite understanding that the journey was extremely dangerous. The journal contained detailed observations about weather patterns, resource availability, and the behavior of other survivor groups. The author had concluded that the environmental conditions would continue to deteriorate for months or years, making long-term survival impossible even for well-prepared groups. Most importantly, they had documented increasing violence and desperation among other survivors, suggesting that cooperation was breaking down as resources became scarcer. Reading that journal forced me to confront possibilities that I had been avoiding. Maybe our efforts to maintain cooperation and coordinate resources were ultimately futile. Maybe the smart survivors were the ones who had already left, accepting the risks of migration, rather than the certainty of slow death in an uninhabitable environment. Maybe I was leading people toward a false hope of survival that would ultimately be more cruel than encouraging them to take desperate chances. The return journey to the airport control tower was the most dangerous travel I had attempted. A winter Storm had moved in while I was visiting the survivor groups, bringing wind speeds that made walking almost impossible, and temperatures that dropped below anything we had experienced. I spent one night sheltering in an abandoned gas station, burning credit cards and paper products to stay warm, enough to avoid freezing to death. When I finally made it back to the control tower, I found that my absence had consequences I had not anticipated. Someone had broken into the building and taken most of my remaining food supplies. The solar panel array that I had been using to charge small electronics had been damaged, probably by ice accumulation during the storm. Most importantly, I found evidence that someone had been living in the building while I was gone, suggesting that my refuge was no longer secure. The isolation in the tower was now complete and terrifying. I had no communication with the outside world, no transportation, and no reliable way to coordinate with other survivors. The building that had been my command center had become a trap that offered shelter but no hope of meaningful survival. I was forced to confront the possibility that my role as coordinator was over and that my focus had to shift to pure personal survival. The silence was the worst part. After weeks of constant radio chatter and human contact, the complete absence of other voices created a psychological pressure that was almost unbearable. I found myself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. I had conversations with imaginary pilots requesting landing clearance, gave vectors to aircraft that existed only in my memory, and provided weather updates to no one. By day 70, I had accepted that my time as a coordinator was over, and my time as a lone survivor had begun. The skills that had made me valuable to the community were no longer relevant. Communication equipment was useless without power. Coordination was impossible without contact. My survival now depended on the most basic human capabilities: finding food, staying warm, and avoiding the dangers that surrounded me in a city where civilization had collapsed completely. Day 75 was when I hit my lowest point, but it was also when I discovered what it really means to survive. I had been alone in the control tower for over 3 weeks, rationing the last of my food supplies and burning everything I could find to stay warm. The isolation was driving me to the edge of sanity. I was having full conversations with air traffic controllers who existed only in my memory, giving landing clearances to ghost aircraft, and maintaining fictional weather reports for pilots who would never call. That morning, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I was going to leave the tower and make one final attempt to reach the survivor groups, not as their coordinator, but as someone who needed their help to stay alive. I had burned through most of my survival supplies during the weeks of isolation, and staying in the tower was simply waiting to die slowly. If I was going to die, I wanted it to be while trying to reconnect with other human beings. I packed what remained of my gear and began the dangerous journey back into the city. The conditions had deteriorated even further during my isolation. The temperature was consistently below zero, even during the brief periods of daylight that penetrated the ash-filled sky. Snow was falling almost continuously, and the wind created drifts that shifted the landscape daily, making navigation by
landmarks impossible. The journey to Market Base nearly killed me twice. I fell through ice into a flooded street and had to crawl out with clothing that froze solid within minutes. Later, I got trapped in a collapsed building when snow shifted
and blocked my exit route. I spent 4 hours digging myself out with bare hands that lost feeling long before I reached daylight. But when I finally made it to the mall, I discovered something that changed everything about my understanding of survival. Market Base was not just surviving, they were adapting. Lisa Chen and her group had made modifications to their living space that showed genuine long-term thinking. They had enclosed sections of the mall with salvaged materials to create smaller, more heatable spaces. They had established workshops where people were manufacturing tools and equipment from salvaged materials. Most importantly, they had developed systems for food production that gave them hope for sustainability beyond their initial supplies. Lisa explained that they had raided the garden center and pet store to establish hydroponic growing systems in the areas with the best natural light. They were growing sprouts and microgreens that provided essential nutrition to supplement their stored food. They had also established rabbit breeding programs using animals from the pet store, creating a renewable protein source that could sustain them indefinitely if properly managed. But the most impressive change was in their social organization. They had established work assignments, resource-sharing protocols, and decision-making processes that ensured everyone contributed according to their abilities and received according to their needs. People had specialized roles based on their skills and interests. Former retail workers had become maintenance specialists. Customers who had been trapped in the mall had developed expertise in food production and animal husbandry. The group had also developed defensive measures that showed they understood the changing nature of human behavior in desperate times. They had barricaded entrances, established watch schedules, and created protocols for dealing with hostile encounters. Lisa told me that they had been forced to turn away several groups of people who had become dangerous, and they had defended themselves against at least 2 attempted raids by armed groups seeking to take their resources. What struck me most was that Market Base had moved beyond simple survival and was beginning to rebuild something that resembled civilization. They had teachers working with children to maintain education. They had people focused on entertainment and morale maintenance. They had established basic medical care, using supplies and knowledge from group members. They were not just waiting for rescue or return to normalcy. They were creating a new normal that could function in the world that existed now. Schoolhouse had undergone a similar transformation, but with different strengths and focus areas. Tom Bradley had organized the group around practical skills and resource management. They had become experts at scavenging useful materials from abandoned buildings, processing them into tools and supplies, and maintaining equipment under impossible conditions. The mechanical skills that existed in the group had been amplified through cooperation and shared learning. The school had advantages in terms of space and infrastructure that they had learned to exploit effectively. They had converted classrooms into workshops, storage areas, and specialized living spaces. The gymnasium had become a community meeting area where people gathered for meals, entertainment, and group decision-making. They had maintained the educational focus of the institution, with adults teaching children and each other skills that were essential for survival. Tom had also established contact with other survivor groups in the region, using methods that did not depend on electronic communication. They had developed signal fire protocols, message drop systems, and scheduled meeting points that allowed coordination without radio equipment. Through these networks, they had learned that several other communities were surviving and adapting to the new conditions. Hospital Base had faced the most difficult transformation because their original mission of providing medical care had become almost impossible under current conditions. Dr. Martinez had led her group toward a different kind of sustainability, focused on preserving medical knowledge and providing basic health care with limited resources. They had become experts at treating injuries and illnesses using improvised techniques and salvaged materials. The hospital group had also developed the most sophisticated understanding of the long-term health implications of living in the post-eruption environment. They were tracking respiratory problems, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological conditions that were affecting all survivors. Most importantly, they were developing treatment protocols that could be implemented by people without formal medical training, sharing this knowledge with other groups to improve overall survival rates. Dr. Martinez had made peace with the ethical compromises that survival required, but she had also found ways to maintain medical principles under impossible conditions. They were providing palliative care for people who could not be saved, mental health support for people struggling with trauma and depression, and preventive care that helped healthy people stay healthy. They had transformed from a traditional medical facility into something more like a public health organization. But the most important discovery during my reconnection with these groups was that they had maintained contact with each other and had developed coordination systems that functioned without my involvement. They had established regular trade relationships, shared resource development projects, and mutual support agreements that created a regional network of cooperation. My role as central coordinator had been replaced by direct relationships that were probably more sustainable and resilient. The 3 groups had also made collective decisions about long-term survival strategies that showed sophisticated understanding of their situation. They had concluded that attempting migration south was probably suicide, given current conditions and their limited transportation options. They had decided to focus on creating sustainable communities that could survive indefinitely in the current environment, even if conditions never improved. This meant developing renewable food sources, maintaining and expanding their technological capabilities, and creating social systems that could provide security and stability for children who would grow up in this world. They were not trying to recreate the civilization that had been lost, but rather to build something new that could function under radically different environmental and social conditions. The coordination between groups had evolved into something more sophisticated than my radio network had ever achieved. They had developed specialized roles where each group focused on their comparative advantages while maintaining trade relationships. For resources and services they could not produce themselves. Market Base provided manufactured goods and materials. Schoolhouse provided mechanical services and tool production. Hospital Base provided medical care and health education. They had also developed joint projects that benefited all three communities. They were working together to establish communication networks that did not depend on electronic equipment. They were sharing knowledge about food production, resource management, and defensive strategies. Most importantly, they were maintaining social connections that provided psychological support and prevented the isolation that had nearly destroyed me during my weeks alone in the control tower. During my visits with each group, I realized that my greatest contribution was not technical expertise or coordination skills, but rather the knowledge I had gained about survival under these conditions. I had learned techniques for weather prediction, using natural indicators. I had developed methods for finding and purifying water without modern equipment. I had figured out ways to maintain equipment and preserve resources that could be valuable to all three communities. But I had also learned hard lessons about the psychological challenges of survival that were just as important as the technical knowledge. I understood the importance of maintaining daily routines and long-term goals to prevent despair. I had experienced the dangers of isolation and the vital importance of human contact for mental health. I had learned to recognize the signs of depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions that could be just as deadly as physical injuries. The most profound realization was that survival was not an individual achievement, but a community effort. The people who were thriving were those who had found ways to contribute to group efforts and maintain social connections. The people who were struggling were those who had been forced into isolation or who had not found meaningful roles within their communities. My 3 months of survival had taught me that the skills which seemed most important at the beginning of the crisis were not necessarily the ones that mattered most for long-term success. Technical knowledge and equipment were valuable, but adaptability, cooperation, and psychological resilience were more essential. The people who survived were not necessarily the ones who had been best prepared for the specific disaster that occurred, but rather those who could adapt quickly to completely new circumstances. The environmental conditions showed no signs of improvement, and radio reports from other regions suggested that the climate changes were permanent rather than temporary. But the survivor communities I had reconnected with were demonstrating that human adaptation could create sustainable ways of life, even under these extreme conditions. They were building something that might not have been what anyone had planned for, but that could provide security and meaning for people who chose to embrace the reality of the new world. As I prepared to integrate myself into one of these communities, rather than maintaining my role as an external coordinator, I understood that the 90 days since Yellowstone erupted had been just the beginning of a much longer process of human adaptation. The crisis had destroyed the civilization that existed before, but it had also revealed human capabilities for resilience, cooperation, and innovation that might not have been apparent under normal conditions. The most important lesson was that survival required accepting change rather than hoping for return to previous conditions. The people who were building sustainable communities had let go of the world that was lost and committed themselves to creating something that could work in the world that actually existed. They had learned that hope had to be based on realistic possibilities rather than wishful thinking, but that realistic hope could be just as powerful as any fantasy about rescue or recovery.